Thinking, Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman explores how human thinking operates through two distinct but constantly interacting modes of thought, and how understanding these modes can radically change the way we make decisions, judge situations, and understand our own mistakes. The first mode, often called fast thinking, works automatically and effortlessly, relying on intuition, habits, emotions, and mental shortcuts to make rapid judgments without conscious effort. This system allows us to recognize faces, complete simple sentences, detect danger, and make snap decisions, but it also makes us vulnerable to systematic errors because it relies heavily on assumptions, stereotypes, and incomplete information. The second mode, known as slow thinking, requires deliberate effort, concentration, and logical reasoning. It is responsible for complex calculations, careful planning, self-control, and critical analysis, but it is mentally demanding and therefore used less frequently. Much of the book demonstrates that humans overestimate the role of slow, rational thinking in their lives, while in reality most decisions are driven by fast, intuitive processes that operate below conscious awareness. Kahneman explains that the fast system constantly generates impressions, feelings, and impulses that the slow system may endorse or correct, but often the slow system simply accepts these suggestions without scrutiny because engaging in deep thinking is tiring. This dynamic explains why people feel confident in judgments that are objectively flawed and why intuition often feels right even when it is wrong. The book introduces the idea of cognitive ease, where information that is familiar, clear, repeated, or emotionally appealing feels more true and trustworthy than information that is complex or unfamiliar, regardless of its actual accuracy. This is why repetition increases belief, why simple messages are persuasive, and why people confuse confidence with competence. Kahneman discusses how our minds are wired to jump to conclusions based on limited evidence, a tendency he describes as what you see is all there is, meaning we form coherent stories from whatever information is immediately available and ignore what we do not know. This leads to overconfidence, faulty predictions, and poor risk assessment. One major theme of the book is cognitive bias, which refers to predictable patterns of deviation from rational judgment. These biases are not random mistakes but systematic errors rooted in how the brain processes information. For example, anchoring occurs when people rely too heavily on the first piece of information they receive, even if it is irrelevant, such as an arbitrary number influencing estimates. Availability bias causes people to judge the likelihood of events based on how easily examples come to mind, which explains why dramatic or recent events feel more common than they are. Representativeness bias leads people to judge probability based on similarity rather than actual statistics, causing them to ignore base rates and logical reasoning. Kahneman explains that humans are poor intuitive statisticians and frequently misunderstand randomness, seeing patterns where none exist and attributing meaning to chance events. The book also explores how narratives shape memory and judgment, showing that people remember experiences not as they occurred in total but based on peak moments and endings, a phenomenon that affects how we evaluate past experiences and make future choices. This insight explains why people may prefer longer experiences with pleasant endings over shorter ones that are objectively better, and why memory does not accurately reflect reality. Another central contribution of the book is prospect theory, which Kahneman developed with Amos Tversky to explain how people actually make decisions under risk. Unlike traditional economic models that assume rational actors seeking to maximize utility, prospect theory shows that people evaluate outcomes relative to a reference point and are more sensitive to losses than to gains, a phenomenon known as loss aversion. Losing something feels psychologically more painful than gaining something of equal value feels pleasurable, which leads people to take irrational risks to avoid losses and to behave conservatively when facing potential gains. This explains behaviors such as holding on to losing investments too long, refusing fair trades, and overvaluing what one already owns, known as the endowment effect. The book highlights how framing influences decisions, showing that people react differently to the same outcome depending on whether it is presented as a gain or a loss, even when the objective result is identical. Kahneman also discusses the illusion of understanding, where people believe they understand complex systems such as markets, economies, or personal success, despite these systems being heavily influenced by randomness and uncertainty. This illusion leads to hindsight bias, where past events appear predictable after they have occurred, causing people to overestimate their ability to forecast the future and learn the wrong lessons from experience. The book critiques the culture of expert prediction, showing that many confident forecasts perform no better than chance, especially in fields involving human behavior, and that expertise often fails to translate into accurate long-term predictions. Kahneman emphasizes the difference between intuitive confidence and statistical reality, warning that confidence is often driven by coherence rather than correctness. Another key idea is the distinction between the experiencing self and the remembering self, which represent two different ways humans evaluate happiness and well-being. The experiencing self lives in the present moment and feels pleasure or pain as events unfold, while the remembering self constructs a story of the experience afterward and determines how it is recalled. Decisions about future experiences are often made by the remembering self, which prioritizes memory over actual experience, leading to choices that do not maximize real happiness. This insight challenges traditional ideas about satisfaction and raises important questions about how well-being should be measured and pursued. Throughout the book, Kahneman illustrates how humans struggle with self-control because the slow thinking system is easily depleted, making people more susceptible to temptation, impulsive decisions, and mental shortcuts when tired, stressed, or distracted. This explains why willpower fluctuates and why people make poorer decisions under cognitive load. The book also explores how organizations and systems can be designed to account for human biases rather than ignore them, emphasizing the importance of structured decision-making, checklists, statistical thinking, and external feedback to counteract intuitive errors. Kahneman argues that while individuals cannot eliminate biases entirely, they can learn to recognize situations where intuition is unreliable and rely more on data, rules, and deliberate processes in those contexts. He also highlights that expertise based on valid patterns and consistent feedback can produce reliable intuition, but many real-world environments do not provide the conditions needed for intuitive skill to develop. The book ultimately challenges the idea that humans are rational decision-makers, replacing it with a more realistic view of bounded rationality shaped by mental shortcuts, emotions, and social influences. It encourages humility in judgment, skepticism toward confident predictions, and greater awareness of how the mind works behind the scenes. By understanding the interaction between fast and slow thinking, readers gain insight into why they think the way they do, why mistakes are so common, and how better decisions can be made by slowing down at critical moments, questioning assumptions, and designing environments that support thoughtful choices. The overarching message is not that intuition is useless or that rationality is always superior, but that wisdom comes from knowing when to trust instinct and when to engage careful reasoning, recognizing that the human mind is powerful yet deeply flawed, and that progress lies in understanding these limitations rather than denying them.